Welcome back. Let's turn our attention now to something that concerns billions around the world. The US envoy John Kerry has warned that the United Nations COP28 climate summit in Dubai was the world's last chance to keeping its target for limiting global warming alive. The bigger question is whether COP28 is now headed to being dead. This is after the COP28 president, Sultan Al Jaber, proposed a draft deal that did not include a phase-out of fossil fuels, which is a setback to the United States, the European Union and low-lying islands most vulnerable to climate change. Joining us now for more on that, Sunita Narayan, also joined by Aarti Khosla and Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Sunita Narayan, let me come to you first. Are you looking at this being a colossal failure, COP28?
Vishnu, it will definitely be a failure if we don't get the right words in. But it's really ironical for me that you are using John Kerry as your yardstick for success and failure. And that John Kerry, if he says that the words on fossil fuel are not in, the fact is the US today is producing more oil than ever in history, than in history of any country, any time in the world. 13.5 million barrels a day. And the fact is it's overtaken Qatar as the biggest exporter of natural gas. Definitely we need the words phase out of fossil fuel in the text, but it needs to be accompanied by two other words, that this needs to be fair and it needs to have funding. Now the US is, this is shadowboxing. The EU and the US are now ramping up their fossil fuel consumption, production. And let's be very clear, it's a very easy target to put coal in the dock because countries like India are dependent on coal, so is China, so are other parts of the developing world. It's also a fossil fuel, so is oil, so is gas. As an environmentalist, all of it needs to go, but it all needs to go with measures of equity, fairness, and funding.
Dr. Ghosh, in terms of what COP28 has done in terms of technology transfer, looking at financing large parts of the world, has anything been done over there for sustainable efforts at fighting climate change to be encouraged?
Vishnu, all COPs have a formal negotiation process, and then there is things that happen on the sidelines. So on the sidelines, for instance, India in the very first week relaunched along with Sweden something called Lead IT, the Leadership Initiative for Industry Transition, basically focusing on the technologies and the collaborations needed to decarbonize our heavy industries like steel or cement, etc. But when it comes to the formal negotiations, I'm afraid we've not seen anything of substance that has come through yet, precisely because the focus has been on this global stocktake, which right now has very weak language. In part, because of this whole controversy around, is it just phasing down of coal or why not phasing down of all other fossil fuels? But also in part because we are not shining enough of a spotlight on the inaction of the developed countries with regards to what they had promised. This is with regards to their pre-2020 commitments. But as our research at CW shows that even in this decade, their implementation gap compared to what they have promised and where they will get to, from 36% reduction of promises and only 11% actual reduction is the pathway they're on, they will end up swallowing up another 3.7 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which basically is carbon space taken away from the rest of the world. So whether it is the phase down of all fossil fuels rather than just targeting coal, whether it is shining a spotlight and holding countries accountable for their implementation gaps, or whether it is about the lack of technology cooperation or the lack of sufficient finance, on many fronts, we are right now looking at a fairly weak outcome.
Yeah, I just wanted to go across and get a comment from Aarti as well. Aarti, I guess the only reason that we are actually discussing this is because we would be in incredible trouble if global warming went beyond 1.5 degrees. For the benefit of our viewers, let's not lose sight of the larger picture. Where are we headed potentially?
So ironic that 8 years ago on this day, the Paris Agreement was signed. And those of us who were following this know that this was the day when the whole historic agreement came into place, and at that time the world was already zero point 0.9 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and today the breach is 1.25 degrees. We are trying to save and stay at 1.5, but we are already crossed 1.25 degrees. So pretty much it's a matter of how much you respect science or how much you can look at political gains. The COP process, as much as it recognizes science, does not come with any kind of decision which is aligned to science, and that's pretty clear. I think it's also very clear that it has become all the more difficult to neatly place countries into aligned groups. We all know that the way the COP negotiations happen, you will have the developing countries clubbed in as the group of 77 and China. Some are also clubbed in as the like-minded developing countries, which includes a range from India to Saudi. But we saw at this COP, for instance, a letter that was sent by OPEC to encourage all its member states to really oppose a phasing out or a phasing down language of fossil fuels. And when you have that kind of a lobby, then it is very difficult to actually make decisions. If you look at the text from yesterday in UN speak, it has all very nice wordings on inviting, urging, recognizing, but there are very few decisions, and whatever is there is just a menu of options which says you could do renewables, you could do nuclear, you could also do energy efficiency, you could do carbon capture and abatement, and really this is a text that has come without any timelines or commitments, either on finance or on reducing fossil fuel production and consumption. So you're left with a situation where the COP was supposed to end today. Of course, it probably will go on till tomorrow. But even at that time, you don't know whether you will get a deal which is good enough to pass the muster or not. With the way things are looking, it probably might not be so. But I suppose the silver lining, if anything, is the fact that climate action is so entrenched in domestic policy making across all kinds of government apparatus in India that perhaps this will not be a deal breaker, so to say. But
Sure.
looking at the politics of how things are, looking at as well the unhelpful role of US in the negotiations, it's pretty stark and dismal what is going on.
Again, Sunita, the larger picture over here is that this is well upon us, right? If we were having this conversation between 8 and 10 years back, we would have said perhaps climate change is having an impact. We now know it is. Extreme weather events, etc., etc. Again, for the benefit of our viewers, why are we having this conversation?
Thanks, Vishnu. I think thanks for reminding us on that real truth, the urgency of it. I mean, we at CSE have just published this report, which we do annually, on the state of extreme weather events in India. And it's shocking. I mean, it's scary. I mean, we have tracked one extreme weather event a day in India, one a day between January and September. And please understand the term extreme weather event is defined by the Met Department. Mm-hmm. We are looking at increased frequency, intensity of impacts because of climate change. The worst victims of it are the poorest in the world. They are not responsible for the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that is part of the climate justice discussions that need to happen. So if you look and you ask me what should happen at COP this time, you definitely need the issue of fossil fuel in the discussion. From my point of view, I think it is good that we're having this discussion, because for too long we've evaded it, and the Western rhetoric has been just phased out fossil fuel. But the fact is, large parts of the world need development. They need space to grow. The question also is, if there is any fossil fuel which remains, which is allowed for usage, should it be allowed to be used in the world which has overused its quota? Yeah. Or should it be allowed to be used in our parts of the world? We need clean gas to move towards cleaner air. We need to make sure that we have development. We have energy for development. So does Africa. Today, as the Western world has run out of fossil fuel or needs more fossil fuel because of the Ukraine war, they're going into Africa and asking for more and more drilling to take place. The same African continents who were told till a year ago that we should not use fossil fuel, keep it in the ground. So I think it's important for the hypocrisy to be called out. The Western media takes a very simplistic view of these issues. We need to have a more nuanced discussion. And as I said, the argument on fossil fuel has to go with the issue of fairness, who uses it, and the issue of finance, which needs to be augmented for the transition. One last thing that I want to say is that we talk about renewable energy, we talk about the transformation that has to happen in our world. But it is also very clear that all the money that is coming in the name of climate finance is actually coming as equity. It is coming as debt to countries which are already indebted. The cost of capital is very high. So the transformation is not happening. The finance is not there. So if there is a failure of COP, it is because of the Western world's inability to stick to their promises and also to make sure that they can phase out fossil fuels.
Dr. Ghosh, let's talk a little bit about India and our targets. We are doing quite well when it comes to our promises as far as solar is concerned. We are leading perhaps for a country as big as we are, number one. Number two, there's also talk of green hydrogen. So two parts of my question: how are we doing as far as solar is concerned? Is it enough? And number two, when does green hydrogen start becoming viable from a cost perspective? I think you're on mute, Dr. Ghosh. Yeah.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
On the first question, Vishnu, are we doing enough? We've done a lot. In 2010, when the solar mission began, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. We now have over 70,000 megawatts of solar, over 130,000 megawatts of pure renewables, including large hydro. We have over 185,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity. However, we now have a domestic target of trying to get to 500,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity, which basically means every hour for the remainder of this decade, we have to deploy 11 to 12 megawatts of clean energy, which means annually our capacity installation has to kind of triple from about 12, 13, 14 gigawatts a year. We have to get to about 50 gigawatts a year, which then becomes a money issue, a manpower issue, a materials issue. We've got to make sure we get the finance at the lowest cost. We got to make sure that the supply chains are not restricted, and we've got to make sure that our skills and our manpower is ready to deploy this infrastructure. Now, when it comes to, nevertheless, we have now got the world's fourth largest renewable energy market by deployed capacity.
Right.
And yet, we get less than 3% of global clean energy investment. And this is the problem. So when we move to green hydrogen, which now is the second largest green hydrogen target in the world after the United States, it's a huge move towards industrial decarbonization. It's a great move towards positioning India beyond just renewables to looking at the heavy industrial sector. But if you look at the scale of projects going on, we are way down because, again, we've got to try and ensure that the investment starts flowing in and not just the targets that we are setting. In order to do that, we've got to create offtake agreements domestically. We've got to strike up bilateral deals internationally. And most importantly, we've got to create a global architecture of rules that creates a fair, level playing field for green hydrogen. Because again, otherwise, the rules that are being drafted in the United States or in Europe will lock us out of those markets if they are not brought to the same standards as ours.
Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us. Let's hope that tomorrow there is something which is positive. But it's just so wonderful to see three incredibly articulate people talking passionately about an issue which affects so many around the world over and over again. On this network, we promise to keep doing this because this is something which is so very important. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. We'll take a break at this stage, come back with the very latest.